Creativity is the ability to overcome self-imposed constraints. So a lot of times when people think of an art museum, they think of an encyclopedic museum like the Metropolitan Museum of Art. In the case of a single artist museum, exactly as the name suggests, we only display the work of a single artist. And in this case, it's Salvador Dalí. Now, Picasso used to make a joke about Dalí that his mind was like an outboard motor on a boat that never stopped running. It would just go, 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 go. And when you come into this museum, you see evidence of that everywhere. Creativity can be an individual sport. You know, a lot of studies actually show that people are more creative individually than they are as a group. It's also equally true that ideas improve when you work on them with someone else. Read widely, take workshops, try to really understand the creative process. But there also are just easy things that I think all of us can do on a daily basis. Every day, people come up with great ideas, but most people do not engage in capture your ideas. Because people come up with ideas and they're like, oh, I'll remember that. That's a great idea. You won't remember it.
Today we are joined by Kim Macuare, a learning designer, facilitator, and speaker who blends arts and sciences to spark creativity and innovation. Kim serves as the co-director of the Innovation Labs and Director of Education at the Dalí Museum. Kim designs and leads programs that help leaders, teams, and organizations unlock their creative potential and rethink problem solving. In this episode of the In French show, we'll talk about Kim's path, the role creativity plays in shaping organizations, and why innovation matters now more than ever. Kim, welcome to the In French show.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Kim, creativity in general, we have this notion that, certain people are creative and others are not, right? Is that a true notion? Is it a gift or is it a habit, or can it be learned?
I definitely think that creativity can be learned. I think it goes back to, how do you define creativity? A lot of times I say that creativity is seeing and doing things differently. When you can see and do things differently, it changes the range of possibilities. It opens up new possibility space for things to emerge. And then another definition that is an amazing one is creativity is the ability to overcome self-imposed constraints. The limits that we put on ourselves are the ones that are holding us back. And so I think whether you see it as self-imposed constraints or whether you see it as seeing and doing things differently, those are both things that people can absolutely grow in their ability to see things differently. People can experiment with doing things differently. People can learn to recognize the constraints that they're putting on themselves, and they can then work to overcome those. And so because of that, all of us have the ability to grow into more creative people.
When I think of creativity, this idea of putting, constraints on ourselves or, imposing constraints resonates. When I think of creativity, I think of people who can paint, draw, sing, right? But creativity seems to go much beyond that.
Yes, because, and I don't think that you're wrong to think that, because I feel I've done a search before, for curiosity's sake, of magazine covers when they have a creativity issue. And it never fails that the creativity issue has paint, crayons, works of famous art on it, because it's almost as if art is a mental shortcut to creativity. When people see it, automatically that resonates. But on the other hand, what it also does is it limits people's conception of what creativity might be. And I would absolutely argue that the same kinds of thinking skills and the same kinds of tool sets that artists use are the ones that have been used to come up with ideas like the iPhone or Airbnb. Creativity has a much wider, it's really content agnostic in that sense.
Kim, how does one become creative in whatever endeavor they might be trying to do, whether it's, trying to do art or, in business as an example, right, which is far away or it seems to be far away?
There's a lot of answers to that question. And of course, one of the things that we could do is read widely, take workshops, try to really understand the creative process. I think that's really key. But there also are just easy things that I think all of us can do on a daily basis. So one of the things that I have found in my own practice and in many people's practice is that every day people come up with great ideas. But most people do not engage in what is really one of the foundational practices of creativity, and that is capture your ideas. Because people come up with ideas and they're like, oh, I'll remember that. That's a great idea. You won't remember it. It's a spark in the moment, and you need to capture the spark. Because later, those ideas can start to coalesce. And what I suggest to people is that when they come up with an idea or they hear something that just for some reason resonates with them or they find interesting, or they read a line in an article or in a book that just really speaks to them, put it in your capture file. And every couple of months, read through your capture file. And I have always found that whenever I do that, something new jumps out at me, because maybe when I heard that quote, for example, I didn't have a use for it. But now, some months down the line, I'm working on a project and I read that quote and now it hits differently. And now it means something and it sparks an idea in me that it didn't before. And, that's just one small practice that anyone can do that will help you start to improve your creativity. A second really small practice that helps people be more creative, and it's really part of that overcoming self-imposed constraints, is try to identify, whenever you're dealing with any kind of challenge or any kind of issue, try to identify all of the assumptions that you have about the situation. And then challenge those assumptions. And, so if you're thinking about like this meeting that isn't as productive as it could be, and it seems to be, wasting people's time or not accomplishing its goals, what are the assumptions that you have about that meeting? That it happens at a certain time of day, that it happens with a certain frequency, that it includes certain people, that it has a certain structure. Challenge all of those assumptions and see what kind of emerges from that, because you might find that the meeting isn't what you need.
Understood. Kim, as an entrepreneur, I'm many times asked, fairly complex questions, and I need to think on the spot, right? What is the magic of being creative on the spot? Is it practice? Or is it, for example, questioning the constraints very quickly? Can these models be, extended further for being creative with a time constraint?
Yes and no. So I definitely think that all of us, are put into situations where sometimes we're asked to give answers on a tight timeline. And in that case, when you're working on a tight timeline, almost always, yes, your experience over time helps move you towards being able to identify and respond more quickly to things. For those challenges, however, and this is where we get into part of creative thinking is recognizing when creative thinking is necessary. Because you don't always need to bring creative thinking to the table. Many times there is a perfectly good known solution for something. And when that thing happens, you should use that solution. We come into difficulties when the problem is not one of those that has a known solution, right? When it's complex, when it's ill-defined, when it's new, when it's intractable. And that's when we need to really bring that creative thinking to the fore. And sometimes we're going to have to do it, kind of like on the spot problem solving. So something breaks down and you don't have the piece you need, but you have this other piece that maybe you can modify. That's that kind of like on the spot having to come up with something. Other times, these are really long range projects. And in that case, what I would say is we can generate ideas, I think, fairly quickly. I think where sometimes we fall down is in taking those ideas, and this takes more time. We can generate the ideas, but then it takes more time to consider those ideas, really being discerning about what's good about them, what might be problematic about them, how could we improve those, and really kind of stress testing those ideas before we then start to put things into practice. Sometimes the timeline won't allow it. You're just going to have to use your best judgment, and always experience, I think, bears out in those situations. But in other situations where we do have more time, I really think that dedicating that time to evaluating ideas and testing them, it pays off.
So again, the core concepts are record your ideas, go back and evaluate them or think about them, and then question the constraints, right? These seem to be, the core principles that you've talked about. Are there other core principles of being creative?
Another one that we talk about in creative problem solving specifically, because of course there's lots of frameworks. There's creative problem solving, there's design thinking, there's Lean Six Sigma, there's Agile. But one that comes up a lot in creative problem solving is called invitational language. And many times when we're thinking about a problem or a challenge, we tend to think about it in a statement form. And sometimes that statement is sales are down, or employees are absent too frequently. And those are statements, and they're true, but they are statements that don't move us any closer to being able to resolve them as problems. As soon as we flip them into invitational language, they become more solvable. So instead of saying, employees are absent too frequently, it's a small switch, but saying, how might we reduce employee absences? Or how might we encourage attendance? How might we, what are all the ways we might improve sales? Those are just small language shifts, but it shifts people's brains into seeing this as, oh, this isn't just something I'm complaining about. This is actually something that needs a resolution. And I find a lot of times, it'll happen to me here at work and someone will say, oh, that process is really terrible. And I'm like, okay, how might we improve the process? What are all the ways that we could make this better? And then they're like, oh, well, we could do this, and we could do this, and we could do this. And I'm like, yeah, let's do it. And it's so much better than just sitting around and complaining about how terrible the process is.
The invitational language inherently seems to be collaborative.
Yes. And that's probably the key, when people think about creativity and innovation. Creativity can be an individual sport. And, a lot of studies actually show that people are more creative individually than they are as a group. Meaning that, if they're allowed to think on their own, they come up with more distinct ideas. However, it's also equally true that ideas improve when you work on them with someone else. So the idea might be this great creative idea that comes from an individual, but if you stay just you in your own head with that one creative idea, it won't be as good as if you share that creative idea with someone else and add their thoughts to it and make it better than it could have been. And so that collaboration point, like inviting somebody else into that problem with me, I think is also, yes, it's a very important aspect.
Is that what is collaborative creativity?
Yes, I think that we need to think about, in a situation where you truly need innovation, because creativity is coming up with a novel concept. Innovation is putting that novel concept actually into action at scale. And so I think in order to achieve innovation, you need to be collaborative. The idea might come from this individual head, but it doesn't become an innovation without a lot of heads coming together in order to make it from an idea into an actual reality.
What more is needed to be able to innovate? The collaboration pieces, and then the idea gets improved because of, you're getting feedback. But how does innovation happen, Kim?
I think that innovation happens when you have in this case, we just want to say like a team. This could be a team, a group, an organization. But you have to be able to not only, because this is a process, right? There's the whole entire creative process. And a lot of times when we're thinking about creativity in the creative process, we tend to focus on the idea generation, because that's the sexy part of creativity. That's the part that you see in the movies where people are throwing up sticky notes and things like that. But there's other parts that play into that. And for an organization to truly be innovative, I think that they have to invest and support and understand and build in the entire pipeline from understanding the problem through implementing the solution.
Awesome, Kim. Thank you for those insights. Somebody who teaches innovation and creativity, that is very powerful for the audience. Tell us more on where you grew up and your family.
Yeah, so I grew up in Cincinnati, but I really grew up in a small little neighborhood called California, Ohio. And it's really small. I mean, like 4 streets by 4 streets. And it's right by the river. And my parents had me and my brother. So we're a pretty small family. And neither of my parents went to college. Actually, I'm the first person in my whole extended family, on both sides to go to college. But my mom and my dad were both big on learning, and especially on reading.
And then early on, you mentioned that you had a lot of interest in books, and your parents really stressed education. And then, what kind of stuff were you interested in as a kid?
So I would say as a kid, I was definitely interested. In retrospect, I can see that I was interested in being creative, but I wasn't interested in being creative in the traditional senses. So I was never really any great shakes at dancing or singing or drawing or anything like that. But I was really imaginative. And so I was always the one who was making up the storyline for the Barbies Or I was also the person who was in the bathroom taking all of my mom's chemicals and mixing them together in the toilet to see what would happen. Don't try that at home, kids. That was a bad idea. It's not good. And I also did really wild things. Like one time I decided to create a newspaper for our neighborhood, our little 100-person neighborhood. And I didn't have a computer, of course. I typed all of the newspapers on a typewriter. And even though I put coupons in that paper, I never asked permission for the corner store if I could put a coupon. So I'm not sure that they were too excited with that creativity. If anybody ever tried to redeem it and they're like, where did this coupon come from? I was just out there making stuff up.
Understood. Through high school, where were your interests leaning towards when it came time, to consider your education forward?
So when I was in high school, I would say I had a couple of really foundational experiences, and that caused me to have a conflict of what I was really interested in doing. I had always been interested in literature and writing, reading. So whenever there was a class project, I always was the person who was like, okay, let's write the play option for the class project, or, oh, let's film the video where we're pretending like we're a talk show. I wanted to always do that creative option, but the creative option that was focused on language and words. But I had a really amazing teacher for art history, and he really inspired this passion in me for art. And that had been something that growing up, we didn't have any art in our house or anything like that. So it hadn't been something I was exposed to. But having taken that class, it became a real competitor for me for my intellectual interest. I was like, so what am I going to do? Am I going to study art history, or am I going to study literature? And I was really torn.
And then you were at University of Cincinnati?
Yeah, I was at UC, which of course is now famous because of Jason and Travis Kelce, who are alum and former football players there. But back in the day, it wasn't as famous, but it was a really nice university. And I started there as an art history major. I decided that was the path that I was going to follow. And I had this idea that maybe I would work in a museum one day, that, would I be a curator? I wasn't sure. But as fate would have it, I took a class on world drama during my freshman year. And again, I thought, I really, really can't just kick this literature habit. I love it so much. It's so meaningful to me. So I changed my major and I pursued my BA in English.
So you changed your major from art history to English. And what kind of literature were you interested in?
I loved, the Romantic poets. I loved Victorian novels. I'm a huge Dickens fan. And that was where my first big love affair with literature came from. It was really born from that 19th century British fiction, whether it be poetry or whether it be novels.
You decided to go deeper into literature and pursued a master's right away?
Yeah, I didn't take any time. I was very sure of myself and what I wanted to do. I had a professor when I was in my undergrad, and her name was Robin Sheets. And she was the first person, and again, kind of coming from my circumstances and, my parents not having gone to college, I had never imagined that I might become a professor. It wasn't even something that I considered or that was on the table for me. And she took me aside one day when I was in my junior year. And she said, you're really good at this. I think that, there's a real future for you in academia, if that's something that you wanted to pursue. And that really changed my life, and it changed my trajectory, and it made me sure of kind of what path I wanted to pursue. And so as soon as I finished my undergrad, I moved straight into my master's. And in my master's, I continued to pursue especially Victorian literature, although I did, also do, lots of other, you have to take your complement of classes across time periods. And typical of myself, as luck would have it, I took a class on medieval literature in my final year of my master's and fell in love with medieval literature and decided that I wanted to pursue medieval literature for my PhD. I had other things that I was also interested in and wanted to do. I wasn't really ready to go straight into my PhD. I had always had this lifelong goal that I would really learn to speak another language, that I would become bilingual. That was a huge goal that I had for myself. And so I decided, instead of continuing straight on to my PhD, I had been teaching English as a second language. And I had a student, her name was Anna Maria, and she said, well, if you come to Venezuela, I will set you up with an apartment. I'll help you find an apartment. I'll help you find a job. And you can learn Spanish. And I said, well, I will do that. And I sold my car and I bought a ticket to Venezuela. And I went there that first time, not with any intention of staying. I went there in 1996. And I just happened to meet my husband. And I ended up, instead of staying for a few months to learn Spanish, I did learn Spanish, did fulfill my goal of becoming bilingual, but I ended up staying 2 years in Venezuela before I came back to the States in the late 90s to finally go ahead and pursue that PhD.
Which city did you buy your ticket for? Where did you go to in Venezuela?
Straight to the capital. I went to Caracas. And that's where I lived until I got married. And my husband is from a city that's to the south of Caracas, which is called Valencia.
How was Caracas?
I loved it. It was the first time I'd ever lived truly in a metropolis. I had lived in Cincinnati, which is a big enough city, but I lived in the outskirts. I lived in the suburbs more than in the city itself. And so it was my first time really living in a city. And it was exciting, and I loved the energy and meeting all of these different people, many of them not from, Caracas, some of them not even from Venezuela.
And different occupations, or many of them, teachers like you?
So most of the people that I worked with, because at the time I was trying to avoid anybody who spoke English, because I knew that the secret to really learning a language was to not make friends with people who spoke English, because as soon as I did that, I would never learn Spanish. So most of the people that I met actually worked in corporations in Venezuela. So they worked in all kinds of corporations, but many of them are associated with the oil industry there, because that's such a huge industry in Venezuela, and especially at that time.
Understood. So you basically did complete immersion when learning Spanish.
Yes. If I heard English, I turned around and started walking the other way. And I took the bus and struck up conversations with strangers and took the metro and talked to people. And I really put myself out there in uncomfortable situations sometimes. But I knew that I needed to do that if I ever really wanted to do more than order in a restaurant. If I really wanted to have meaningful conversations with people, I needed to go out there and get uncomfortable.
And how quick was your progression with Spanish?
I would say that it took me about 6 months to become very proficient at understanding pretty much everything that was happening. But it took me a year before my proficiency got to a level where I could contribute to a conversation in real time.
Kim, as a side note, I lived in Korea for 6 years and can relate a lot to what the immersive experience you had. I did something similar, and I ended up discovering that I need to learn Chinese characters to be able to learn Korean. And my vocabulary just exploded, from there. My vocabulary eventually grew to tens of thousands of words. And people who didn't learn the roots were stuck at a few hundred. And then immersion, I used to roam around with a electronic dictionary in my hand, punching in, what each word meant. So this is awesome. I think immersion is a great way to learn, and you can spend a lifetime, outside, but never learn the language, right? But I think it also takes a certain amount of courage, right, to be able to do that.
Yeah, I think that, given your experience as well, some people wouldn't feel comfortable with that. Some people wouldn't feel comfortable with walking around with a dictionary and putting the words in and trying to strike up that conversation and keep it going. And I think that people who tend to be successful at learning languages are people who can put that embarrassment aside and be okay with not being perfect, and understanding that if you make that intent, somebody else is going to reciprocate and they're going to make the intent as well. And together you're going to, move along, maybe struggle along, but you're going to move along in that conversation.
Awesome. You had this awesome immersive experience learning Spanish over the years. You became very good at it. And then you decided to come back and pursue your PhD?
Yeah, it was always going to happen. I just think that having gone straight from my bachelor's to my master's, I couldn't make that commitment of another, 5 years right at that time. I think I needed that break, and it was really refreshing to be able to take that time away and learn a language. But the really cool thing that happened, which I wasn't expecting, is, it sounds weird to say it, but when I came back, at the time, of course, I thought, I'm smarter. And I wasn't smarter, but what I was more mature and wiser. Because as we get older, I don't think we get smarter, but I think that we get wiser. And so when I came back, I was such a better student than I was the first time, even though I had always prided myself on being a great student. But the maturity and wisdom, they really helped me to improve my focus, to improve my discipline. And all of those things are absolutely necessary for getting a doctorate. People talk about being smart for getting a PhD, and I'm like, no, that's not the number one criteria. If you want to get a PhD, you better be disciplined.
What was the research area that you focused on, when you were doing your PhD at Ohio State?
So the research area for me was kind of personal, to be honest, and it kind of goes back to my growing up in humble circumstances. I had always been fascinated throughout my life with economics and the way that economics shape people's identities. That is, that much of who we are is shaped by our economic status. And studying medieval literature, it was a really interesting inflection point for that, because you could actually see a point in society when people were changing from a feudalist to a proto-capitalist economy. And that shift wasn't just a shift in monetary instruments or in financial structures. It was a shift in how people actually saw themselves and defined themselves and who they thought they were. And so that really became the focus of my dissertation, was how economics shaped people's identities.
And but you were still majoring in English literature, right? So this was at the boundary between economics and English.
That is again something that in retrospect is really clear to me, but it was not clear to me at the time. Now as somebody who teaches people about creativity and creative studies, I didn't understand then what I know now, which is innovation is always at the intersections.
Understood. And then you decided to go deeper and pursue academia. Right after you finished at Ohio State, you were at Wittenberg, and then after that at Clayton State. Tell us more.
Yeah, so I thought I was pursuing my path. I really believed that literature was going to be something that could sustain my interest over time. That is something I mentioned earlier. I find myself getting restless very easily, but I was constantly interested and enthralled by research on literature and teaching classes. And so it really seemed like something that was going to sustain my interest. And so, yeah, I went ahead and I pursued a visiting professorship at Wittenberg. And then I went on to do I had a tenure track position at Clayton State, which is one of the University of Georgia campuses.
Yep, it's a great program. But in 2008 or so, you left that and went back to Venezuela. Right? Tell us more.
Yeah, and I think this is always where you can plan your path, but you can't control your path. So I was married and still am married. Even though I was living my dream, he wasn't living his dream. And he was incredibly homesick and really just not living his best life. And he had put aside so many things so that I could pursue my goals. So I said, well, I need to be able to do the same thing for him. And so I ended up giving up my tenure track job and we moved back to Venezuela in 2008. And that was a really hard decision, but I've never regretted it because it was the right decision for our family. And I ended up giving my kids the experience of a lifetime, which was to be able to live, not just visit, but live in another country, be immersed in another language and another culture, which of course, because of my husband, it was part of their culture too. And so they not only got the opportunity of living in the United States, but then they also got that opportunity to live full-time in Venezuela.
Awesome. And you started teaching at the International College at Carabobo?
Yeah, I taught at the Colegio Internacional. And sometimes when I think about my teaching, I've done so much teaching, so many classes, so many universities. I'm still teaching. I teach a class every fall at USF on creative thinking. But I believe that that particular job probably changed me more than any other, because I think that job made me aware of the power that teaching has. At the Colegio Internacional, the students who attend that school are of the very high levels of society. Those are the children of the political leaders or the children of the CEOs and the business owners. And I felt a huge responsibility knowing how much power these children were going to have in the future, to really try to help and support them to be better thinkers and better people, because they were going to wield so much influence in this society. And so that was a really interesting experience for me. I'd never felt that level of responsibility before, because it wasn't just about the students. It was about how many people I knew those students were then going to go forth and impact because of the positions that they were going to have. The difference between teaching at the college level and teaching at the secondary level for me was at that level of expanding boundaries of what does it mean to be a teacher. Even now, when I'm a college professor, sometimes I have very warm relationships with my students, but usually I'll never see those students again, except for a very few. But when you teach secondary, you see those students again and again, and you see them over a period of years, and you create a bond and a relationship that goes beyond just the regular student-teacher relationship. And so you have that opportunity to have more of an outsized impact on who they become.
Is this where you started getting interested on the topics of creativity, innovation, exploring boundaries? Tell us more.
I would say that this is where I started to get involved more I'd always been an individual contributor in my university career. But when I was at the Colegio Internacional, I was a part of the administration of the school as the head of the department. And in that role, that was the first time that I had the opportunity to work on collaborative projects that had a bigger footprint than my own classroom. So designing the training for the teachers in the department, or having a working group for changing the way things were done at the school, coming up with the plans and the ideas for how we might achieve some of our school-wide objectives. And so it really was, in practice, the first time that I had engaged in what I would term as kind of collaborative creativity, where it wasn't my individual effort, but it was how do we work as a group to come up with something that's going to really move us to where we want to be as an organization.
Kim, the year's 2015. You're back from Carabobo, Venezuela, and you now start working at the Institute of Advanced Discovery and Innovation. That's where these ideas of that you had and things that you have, that impact that you talked about back in Venezuela, that this could really have an impact of people. You try to bring it to life. What kind of work did you do, back at USF now?
So when I went to USF, this program was just starting, this Institute for Advanced Discovery and Innovation. And the idea behind it was there were these incredible professionals who were now retired. And these are people who still obviously are, but are members of the National Academy of Medicine, the National Academy of Engineers. And even though they've retired from doing these incredible things, like inventing the first left ventricular valve, or figuring out what the surgical applications for lasers might be, coming up with fiber optic cable. I mean, these people were incredible, coming up with all of these amazing inventions. And now they were retired from those jobs, but they weren't retired from life. And so the Institute provided really that link between those individuals and the students and faculty at the University of South Florida. And that is where I started really thinking about this, for me at the time, was a new concept of creativity as something that was teachable and learnable, And so I worked together with a couple of other professors at the university, Michael Cross and Sarah Kiefer, to design a class called Get Innovative. And that class combined theoretical readings, projects, and understanding with these in-person talks and Q&As with these people who were incredible creatives and innovators. And then at the end, the students were able to kind of put together all that theory and practice and engage in their own creative project. And that was a really amazing experience, and it really opened my eyes to the impact that deliberate training in creative thinking and innovation process could have on, in this case, students, but it could just have on people in general.
Awesome. Kim, for people in the audience who want to start on that, a similar journey, where should they start?
Well, I think that there's a lot of really great books. And, of course, maybe because I was a literature professor, I'm always start at the book. But one of my favorite books is called Innovator's DNA. And Innovator's DNA is a really amazing text because it identifies 5 traits that innovators have. And because it does that and it gives you examples, and it really gives, I believe, anyone a pathway for thinking about how might I work on this. So for example, one of them is networking. Great innovators, as I said, you can have a great idea, but you get more and better ideas by going out and talking to people. And so great innovators, many of them have that trait. They call it DNA because, of course, each innovator's own particular profile might look a little bit different, right? Some people are much higher for networking, some are lower, but networking is one of those key qualities. People who go out and talk to other people about their ideas or talk to potential customers to find out what the problem is, they will be better at solving those problems. That's something we can all practice. You could make a deal with yourself. I'm going to go out and I'm going to talk to 5 people this week, and I'm going to ask them, about something. So that book is great for that because I think it gives you really actionable things that you can focus on, and you can kind of choose one and follow that out for a week, a month, a year, and then kind of work on the next trait.
Awesome. Thank you, Kim, for sharing. Kim, for the last 7 years or so, you've been at the Dalí Museum in St. Petersburg. Tell us more about the organization and your role there.
So the Dalí is a single artist museum. So a lot of times when people think of an art museum, they think of an encyclopedic museum like the Metropolitan Museum of Art. In the case of a single artist museum, exactly as the name suggests, we only display the work of a single artist. And in this case, it's Salvador Dalí. And for a person who's always been interested in creativity and innovation, I think that's what first drew me here. And that is, Dalí, of course, is an amazing artist. He's routinely listed as, one of the greatest artists of the 20th century. And, many people say one of the greatest artists of all times. But what I think is really unique about him is people will also say that no one saw the world like Dalí did. The images of melting clocks, of burning giraffes, of these things that came to you straight out of your dreams. He saw the world in a different way. And he was very restless individual creatively. He was always looking for the next style, the next technique, the next technology that was going to help him express himself and his imagination and connect with the viewer in a new and powerful way. Picasso used to make a joke about Dalí that his mind was like an outboard motor on a boat that never stopped running, would just go, 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 go. And when you come into this museum, you see evidence of that everywhere. You know, you come up to the museum and you see all this vegetation, and the vegetation is chosen to be reminiscent of the vegetation that's on the coast of Spain, where Dalí grew up. And then as you enter the building, you see this spiral staircase that pays homage to Dalí's love and interest in the discovery of DNA, which was one of his, kind of side interests. He was very interested in science. And then you look at the structure of the building itself, this juxtaposition of like this concrete block and then this free-flowing glass geodesic structure. And they really represent both the rational and the irrational and how those are married in his art. And so it's really an amazing institution, both the architecture that houses the collection and then the collection itself, which really helps you understand that complex, restless, creative mind that Dalí had, where he was always looking for what was a new way? What was a new way to see something? What was a new way to do something?
How many artifacts or pieces does the museum carry?
We have over 2,000. So there's around 100 oil paintings, but tons of drawings, prints, objects, sculptures. And then that's not counting, what we have in the rare book room or in our archives, where we have lots of archival material.
So while we know Dalí for a few things like the melting clocks that you talked about, right? He did create an incredible number of pieces, right? Or number of objects across a variety of mediums, right?
Yeah, he was very prolific. And it harkens back to something that we were discussing earlier, and that was this idea of the innovations at the intersections. And I think that Dalí was so interested in so many things, literature, fashion, film, science, because he understood that. He understood that those things weren't distractions from his central pursuit. They were actually like fuel. And when he thought about art and science, or art and fashion, or art and film, they gave him all of this creative energy. And then in his own kind of product, you can also see that same diversity. He made films, and he painted paintings, and he did drawings, and he created prints. He designed fashion with Schiaparelli. He made perfume bottles, like jewels. He created a line of surrealist jewelry when hologram technology first emerged. Because for Dalí, that was a moment where you can really see his innovative spirit. Because here's Dalí, and holograms emerge. And the first thing that Dalí thinks is, this could be a really creative solution to the artist's eternal problem of two-dimensionality in art. Yeah, because obviously that's the thing artists are always trying to overcome, that we're talking about this like two-dimensional medium in order to represent three-dimensional things in life. And the hologram for him was a way that he thought, oh, that's how an artist can kind of overcome that problem. So he immediately saw the potential artistic application and the solving of an artistic problem.
Kim, I don't think I'll ever meet somebody who knows more about Dalí than you. I may, but may not. Was he always like that? Or did he have his own journey? He seems to have dabbled in so many things that eventually he became the genius we all know him to be. But what was his early attempts at this like?
So Dalí is one of those probably unique individuals, especially nowadays, who he knew from the time that he was small what he wanted to do. He started painting when he was around 10 years old, and his parents recognized in him this talent, and they provided for him materials, not the best materials. He's a child, right? But they gave him materials. They gave him a studio space, which was their laundry room. And they really indulged that. And even though it wasn't his father's favorite thing in the world, they also, when it was time for him to go to university, he wanted to go to art school. And it's like, okay, he's going to art school. And so he did go to art school. He didn't graduate. That's a fun story about Dalí. He, I believe, purposefully worked to be expelled because his father had always wanted him to go to art school so that when he had a degree, if the artist thing didn't work out for him, he could be a teacher. And I think that Dalí really didn't like that concept because that concept held within it the idea that he wouldn't succeed. And Dalí knew he would. He was always very sure of himself, and he knew from the time that he was very young that he was going to be someone special. And so he got expelled and went directly into pursuing his career as an artist, and pretty quickly was, even in his student days, was exhibited for the first time in the United States and really grew into being this, by the early 30s, he was a huge international figure.
Awesome. We'll have to visit, the museum to learn more about Dalí. Seems to be an absolutely fascinating place. Kim, what kind of work do you do?
So I'm the director of education. So any programs at the museum that have to do with our educational mission. So those could be student programs, adult programs, family programs, lectures, dance, food. It really runs the gamut. And then I also have a special job that connects with a lot of what we've been talking about today. And that is, as co-director of the Innovation Labs, I design and deliver workshops that promote creativity, creative thinking, creative problem solving for organizations and groups.
Awesome. Kim, thank you for sharing. Kim, we live in a world that's changing very, very rapidly. And a lot of people would, need to reinvent themselves. A lot of companies, need to reinvent themselves today and are forced to be creative and innovative because of all the change that is happening, driven by things like AI and so forth. What is your take on AI, and how do you think that landscape is changing?
AI is here. And it's having an impact. So you absolutely can't ignore it. And the one thing that I would always suggest when we're dealing with any change of this magnitude, and a change that still has so many unknowns, is to be cautious and really give consideration to what can and can't be done here. Obviously, my area of interest is creative thinking. Primarily, it's not business. So it's not for me to say how businesses will uptake and implement, artificial intelligence tools and systems. What I would say is I worry about some of the ways that it's going to, and it already is, impacting young learners. And that includes both students and very early professionals. I believe creative practice, whether you're considering that as an artist or whether you're considering that as an entrepreneur and innovator, creative practice involves just what it says, practice. It involves doing. And that doing is from the small stuff to the big stuff. And you know yourself as an entrepreneur, the struggle of creation is part of the value. And, there's a scholar, now sadly passed away, but very famous, Csikszentmihalyi, who talks about the concept of flow and creative flow. And flow comes from something having enough of a level of difficulty to be challenging, but not too challenging. And obviously, as we advance in our practice, that is a moving mark, and difficulty needs to increase for us to stay in flow, which is why, an amazing musician doesn't want to play Mary Had a Little Lamb. They're not going to be, they're done with that. So for me, this is a long way to say, what I worry about with a very quick uptake of AI, especially into educational systems and into early professional tasks, is that I don't think that you can skip over the small stuff to get to the more difficult stuff. I think that you need to go through that small stuff to get to the difficult stuff. And I think that if we start using it to shortcut thinking, then we're missing out on really important formation. And the second thing is, over time, in addition to kind of building that practice and increasing our difficulty, we as thinkers are also building something that we label discernment. And you can't read discernment in a book. Like, I can't read a book that tells me, oh, this is why this is a great poem. But when I've read thousands of poems and I've studied them and I've analyzed them, I recognize through an active discernment what a good poem is. And so that's those two things, the struggle of creative practice and the discernment. I worry about those.
Thank you for sharing, Kim. Kim, this has been a fascinating conversation. We have talked about various kinds of things and your journey and the creative and the innovative side of things. Today we were joined by Kim Macuare. Kim is the co-director of Innovation Labs and director of education at the Dalí Museum. Kim, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I really had a great time.